there's a lot of very interesting research taking place in many, many areas, all linked to both the internal and the external dimensions of human rights and the European Union. And as you know, the topic remains very much à jour, and there are daily kind of challenges in that respect. But this project is indeed generating a lot of dynamics, and I would kindly refer you to our website for all the reports. Some of these reports, before you start printing, watch out, because some of them are above 250 pages. So for ecological reasons, I would recommend that you rather download them than print them out. But we have also everything neatly summarized in policy briefs. We do a lot of events. I will, at the end of this lecture, announce a couple of upcoming frame events. This very Friday, we have a workshop in Sevilla as well, and many other things are scheduled. And for those of you who really say, I take an interest in human rights in the EU, but I don't know anything about it, I can tell you already one thing. We have flyers lying on the table there about our MOOC, and this massive online course has already had a very successful first edition in the autumn of last year, but there will be a second edition of this MOOC, which is freely available to all of you, and we really hope that you will sign up to it once we are again set to start with that MOOC. For your information, there is also the possibility to join the conversation on Twitter. So please go ahead with all kinds of tweets you want to send around the world if you feel like participating in that conversation. Now, so enough, I think, in terms of publicity spot. Let's turn to our speaker and to the subject matter of today. Professor Manfred Nowak received his PhD from the Law School of the University of Vienna and his LL.M. From Columbia University. He has been so many things that it is really impossible to describe them all here. It will fill at least the whole afternoon. So let me just take some highlights from his very rich academic career, but also from his very rich career as a very distinguished human rights practitioner and advocate. He has been United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture. He has also been United Nations expert on enforced disappearances. He has been judge at the Human Rights Chamber of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He has been or is visiting professor at many, many places. Let me just mention a few: the Danish Institute of Human Rights in Copenhagen, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights at Lund University, the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, EIUC, but I have to say something special about EIUC because there's another capacity, the American University, Abo Akademie in Turku, the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights in Utrecht, and I should also stress that he has been director there of that institute in the late 1980s, and I can assure you he speaks a perfect Dutch. He is professor of international law and human rights at the University of Vienna, where he has been co-director of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights since 1992. More than 500 publications on his name in the field of human rights, public international law, development studies, constitutional and administrative law. We have, and now since January, I should almost forget about it, since January, he has become the Secretary General of EIUC, the European Inter-University Center for Human Rights, which, as you know, is based in Venice and takes care of this great EMA, this great European Master's Program in Human Rights and Democratization. We have been working together for quite a long time, I now realize, including, for instance, in the, say, like 10 years ago, on a so-called cost action. The cost action called the European Union, the role of the European Union in United Nations human rights reform. It was a beautiful cost action that Professor Nowak chaired, and which gave rise to lots of interesting, I think, publications and events. And that brings me to the subject matter of today. Because indeed, we studied 10 years ago the EU's contribution to United Nations human rights reform. And that's actually the topic of today. This week, we are only a few days away from that event, the 15th of March, we commemorate, I would say celebrate, 10 years of the United Nations Human Rights Council, set up by the General Assembly Resolution 15th of March 2006. And to the coming about, of which the European Union and its member states very actively contributed. So this is a real nice case study, I would say, of the contribution of the EU to human rights reform. Whether the reform has been a true success, we will have to learn from the lecture. And as you see, the title of the lecture is about achievements, but also about challenges. So I hope that this works enough in terms of a teaser, and I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Nowak.
Exaggerated introduction. Good afternoon. I'm very happy. I'm very honored to be here at one of these so-called high-level lectures. And I'm also happy to speak about 10 years of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is a topic and an organization and body that interests me very much. As you know, and Jan said it already, it's more or less exactly now in March 10 years ago that the General Assembly, by this famous resolution 6/251, established the Human Rights Council as the highest political body of the United Nations dealing with human rights. And thereby it replaced the former Commission on Human Rights, which was established in 1946, foreseen in the UN Charter, Article 68, which, as it was said, was a highly discredited body. It was highly politicized and selective, and even former Secretary General Kofi Annan criticized the Commission, and I quote, had been discredited by states which had sought membership not to strengthen human rights but to protect themselves against criticism. And he proposed a totally different, much smaller body. As you said already, I had been quite, for a long time, closely involved in the Human Rights Commission. Between 1968 and 93, I was member of the Austrian governmental delegation, what the Americans call public members, so as an independent expert, but still somehow under the instructions of the government. So I know it a little bit from a governmental side until 93, and between 93 and 2010 I always had some kind of different expert functions for the Human Rights Commission, in particular in the field of enforced disappearances, working group, special process on missing persons in former Yugoslavia, and other mandates, including then the Special Rapporteur on Torture. So I know it a little bit from the side of government and the side of independent experts, but of course I also have been in quite a few non-governmental organizations, the International Service for Human Rights and others that were criticizing, at the same time engaging with the Human Rights Commission from an NGO perspective. And I must confess I did not belong to those who criticized the Human Rights Commission that much, because I think that the Commission has come quite a long way from the old days, and I'm speaking about the 1950s and 60s, the no power to take action doctrine, where the Commission did not address any kind of practical human rights issues. But then, since the late 1960s, 70s, under these famous resolutions 1235 and 1503, really slowly developing also special procedures. The first one was the working group on South Africa, already established in 1967. Then having a fairly selective period, 1970s, the outcasts, South Africa, Israel, Chile. But then since the 1980s, developing what I would say a fairly effective triangle. So of course it's the states that are members of the Commission and the Council, the only ones they can vote. But at the same time, independent experts played a more and more important role in the Commission. what we call today special procedures, special rapporteurs, working groups, etc. And I think that was one of the main achievements of the Commission, to really integrate non-governmental organizations with the right to speak, with the right to bring victims in the time of the Cold War, that all of a sudden some famous dissidents from the Soviet Union were speaking in the Commission, in the same room where the Soviet governmental officials were speaking. At home they would have been immediately arrested, and here they could speak with them. That was at that time a huge achievement. And also later developing all kind of thematic mechanisms. So I think this triangle worked quite well. The Commission only worked for 6 weeks. That was a disadvantage, March, April in Geneva, but it was a huge, the biggest human rights conference every year, where more or less 3,000 people were coming together, governmental people, NGOs, indigenous peoples, media, you name it, and really discussing the main human rights issues. Cide Kędzior, one of famous Polish professor in Bosnia, once called the Human Rights Commission and Council a kind of a global parliament on human rights. I think that's a quite good expression what it is actually doing. Now, I made this short excursion back into the history because if we want to really assess today the success or failure of the Human Rights Council, we have to compare it to the Commission. We have to say, is it better than the former Commission, or is it worse, or is it about the same? So what are actually the achievements in comparison to the Commission, but also what are the major challenges? For that I give you a very short, and I apologize to those who say we know that anyway, but I talked before, there might also be some persons who are not that well familiar with it. What are the main differences between the former Commission and the Council? Now, the one is the status. The Commission was a functional commission of ECOSOC. The Council is a subsidiary body of the General Assembly. The word Council already indicates it's one of the main bodies, like the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council. We have now also finally a Human Rights Council, although of course it's not one of the main bodies because we would have needed an amendment to the UN Charter. But still, it's higher. The composition, Kofi Annan wanted a small body, 18 people or so, like the Security Council. After long negotiations, they then reduced from 53 to 47. So it's not a big change, but, and that is important, they fixed the regional representation. Because in the old days, the West was kind of overrepresented, which was widely criticized. Now we have from the 47, 13 from Africa, 13 from Asia. Together 26 is a comfortable majority of the African Asian bloc, including of course the NAM, the non-aligned movement, the African Union, but also the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. And we will see then at the beginning they really exercise their power in a quite strong way. One of the main kind of most controversial issues when the resolution was negotiated was, but we only want to have the angels in there. Yeah? The Commission was bad because some of the bad apples were also sitting in the Commission. The Americans were very strong about that, saying you have to have the highest standards of human rights, and others said that the first ones who have to go out are the Americans under the Bush administration. But still, the resolution says that you should only be a member if you uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights, which would actually mean that many of the main players, permanent members of the Security Council, China, Russian Federation, would certainly not be allowed to sit on the council. I think it's simply unrealistic. It's a political body, and in a political body you must have a fair representation of also the powerful states, otherwise it's, politically speaking, not a useful body. But at least you can exclude some of the worst violators of human rights. So I hope, so far, for instance, North Korea was avoided to become a member of the Human Rights Council. And that is also important, now the General Assembly has the power by a 2/3 majority to suspend membership. And we had one case, Libya, in 2011. The Gaddafi regime was expelled from the council. Last year there was some discussion about Burundi, but finally Burundi was elected, which is not a very good sign. In September 2015, elect Burundi into the Human Rights Council when the situation is very, very serious and might even lead to another genocide. Also, states should make voluntary pledges and commitments. And I think that's good. So if you want to be elected, you should pledge, for instance, that you ratify some of the key human rights treaties, or you invite special procedures, or any other kind of commitments. Third one is the sessions. As I told you, the Commission only met for one session, 6 weeks. In 1992, with respect to former Yugoslavia, they started to have by one half could ask for special sessions, but there were only very few. And now it is 3 regular sessions plus 1/3, so a minority right can convene a special session. That means 16 states can do that. That is already, I think, a big advantage, and we will see in the course of the years we have almost as many special sessions than we have regular sessions. Universal periodic review. That is seen as the most innovative feature. We haven't had that before, that every of the 193 member states is undergoing in a 4.5 years cycle a general peer review of its general human rights performance. And that was seen also by the South as the main tool against the selectivity of the old Commission. Of course, in the minds of many southern states was, then we can get rid of all this naming and shaming. That means also country-specific special procedures, etc. And the Universal Periodic Review, as I said, is a peer review. So states provide a report, what they all have done, positively or not done, and then it is reviewed by other states. There's a troika, etc. But, and that was again something the EU really strongly demanded during the negotiation, that it's not only the state report, there are also 2 other reports compiled by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, one on the most important conclusions and recommendations of treaty bodies and special procedures, so UN expert bodies. The other one also a summary of the most important reports, criticism by civil society, non-governmental organizations, also national human rights institutions, etc. And if you take all those 3 reports together, I think it is giving you already a fairly good entry point if you want to know what's going on in a particular country in the field of human rights. But still at the end, of course, this working group of the Council then comes up with recommendations. There might be hundreds of recommendations, and the state is free to accept or to decide which recommendations it accepts and which one it says we are thinking about and rejects. But I will come again back to an assessment. We have an advisory committee of 18 people, that's independent experts, replacing the former subcommission on the promotion and protection of human rights. with somewhat less powers. The subcommission was seen as to be too active, too proactive, also taking up country situations that was eliminated in 1999 already, but now they couldn't do anything anymore on their own initiative. So it's a think tank, but only in reaction to being invited by the Council. We also have the old confidential and public complaints procedures, 1503 procedure, which is a little bit anachronistic, I would say, today. And of course, the special procedures, so the special rapporteurs have in principle been taken over. So that's somehow the differences, and I will come back to that at the end when I assess. If we now want to assess the practice of the Human Rights Council, I distinguish two major periods. The initial period, the first 5 years between 2006 and 2010, and then the recent 5 years since 2011, which of course where the Arab Spring played a very important role in really changing the dynamics, and also where the Obama administration entered the stage, because the Bush administration from the beginning said we don't want to have to do anything with them, this is not a useful body, and Obama again, multilateralism, and the Obama administration did play a quite important role, because at the beginning kind of the Western ideas and values were really left to the European Union to defend and a few other states. So the EU felt itself at the beginning in a fairly isolated position. We have to do it alone, and we only have 7, sometimes 8 members, but it's a very small minority. So we have to build alliances, primarily with the GRULAC, the Latin American groups, but that was also not enough. So Europe and the Latin Americans don't have a majority. So you need to really build cross-country and cross-regional alliances, and that was at the beginning very difficult for the European Union, which also has to do a little bit with its fairly heavy decision-making, unanimity, etc. procedure, in particular also before the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. And of course, one also has to say that the timing couldn't have been worse if you think about the global political situation. In 2005, it was just 2 years after the American invasion in Iraq. It was still 9/11. You had the Bush administration, Putin on the other side. So the new kind of North-South conflict being very, very strong. So it was difficult at that time already to negotiate the General Assembly resolution and really to start with. I'm not going into details, but we were at a certain point, and I was, as a special rapporteur, appointed in 2004. So I was just in the office when we changed to the council. And we were threatened. There were many states, and now you had this new kind of alliances, the non-aligned movement, 120 states, but then the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, 57 states, and some of them, and the African group, African Union, the League of Arab States, and some states became major actors. The ambassador of Algeria, for instance, was one of the most powerful persons, because he represented the African Union, the League of Arab States, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. So he had in relation to the 2009 events when the LTTE was defeated by the Sri Lankan military and major crimes had been committed by Sri Lanka. And rather than taking this up stronger in relation to Sri Lanka, they decided that there should be, there was a resolution which asked the Office of the High Commissioner to present an overview of the composition of its staff. So a strong attack on the independence of the High Commissioner. And the year afterwards, there was a very, very long discussion where, again, the European Union defended very much the independence, but there were many states that strongly attacked the independence of the High Commissioner and really wanted to put it under some kind of state micromanagement. What was strong in 2013 was a high-level International Commission of Inquiry on North Korea. Michael Kirby, the famous Australian judge, was the chairperson. There was an independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons, and that's again quite interesting because there is a move from the Global South that they say the UN should adopt a convention on the rights of older persons falling under these vulnerable groups, which the EU also says that it defends. But in fact it's the EU that so far has obstructed these developments. 2014 we had sessions on the Central African Republic, again Gaza and Iraq, but already more related to the Islamic State. A special rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities, and a highly controversial special rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. But then also a discussion about the negative impacts of vulture funds, also hedge funds in principle, on the enjoyment of human rights, where the EU was split. Similar, there was a split resolution on armed drones, where I think Ireland was the only European state that voted in favor. At the same time, France and the United Kingdom strongly voted against, and the other EU members abstained. So even within the European Union, a split. And finally, last year we had two special sessions. One was really on a non-state actor, Boko Haram, and the other one on Burundi. As I said before already, Burundi, to prevent a further deterioration into genocide, but at the same time behind the scenes states thought, but actually we should exclude Burundi from the Human Rights Council, what didn't really work out. And we have a new special rapporteur on the right of privacy in the digital age. Again, cross-regional, Brazil and Germany as the main sponsors. They started already in the GA after the revelation of the Edward Snowden reports. So that's an interesting new development on how to limit surveillance. We have an independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights of persons with albinism. That was an Algerian initiative in the African group. So it's quite now much more diverse. Also a new resolution on human rights, democracy and the rule of law, so establishing a new forum similar to the Forum on Minority Rights. And of course, in the last years, more and more discussion centered on migration, the crisis of the refugee policies, and Europe and the European Union felt more and more attacked in the Human Rights Council, both by the former High Commissioner Navi Pillay from South Africa, but also the current High Commissioner Said Rad al-Hussein from Jordan, speaking out very, very strongly at the failure of Europe to deal in a dignified manner with the refugee and migration situation. And of course, you mentioned before François Crépeau, who was here as a European special rapporteur on human rights of migrants, strongly criticizing the European migration policy. So there's a new dynamics also, and the EU finds itself more and more on the defensive. Time is running, so I'm not going into really more into the role of the European Union. Come to my, of course, also a major change is, of course, the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, the External Action Service, the High Representative and the EU Special Representative on Human Rights, Stavros Lambrinidis, and of course a permanent COHOM chair. All that had a new dynamics in in better coordinating also the European Union input, the strategic framework of 2012, the 2 EU action plans, all had an input in a much more strategic way how the European Union is also acting in the United Nations Human Rights Council. And in principle, one can say that the EU lived up to its own strategies in relation to, but its classical kind of interests. So for instance, when it is about the independence of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to defend the independence of special procedures and treaty bodies, to defend human rights defenders and their independence, civil society, then the European Union is extremely successful against the majority of other states that are much more hostile. Also, most of the initiatives are in the field of civil and political rights. But when it comes to economic, social and cultural rights, then I think the EU, although it says in particular in the new action plan, really we should do much more on economic, social and cultural rights, but then when these issues are taken up in the Human Rights Council, usually the EU is saying, but those are not really human rights, and so there is really an ambiguity, and I think one of the main outcomes also of the so far of the frame project is that is a major issue. As long as you don't take economic, social and cultural rights seriously, you are not living up to the indivisibility and interdependence of all human rights. They are very close to the heart of the countries in the global south, and you will be seen as very selective. The EU is seen as selective. The same also country specific. If you analyze that, it's very much in relation to economically weak or isolated states, and the EU is much less outspoken when it goes about its own trade partners and allies, even if their human rights violations are as serious as in other countries. So the EU is criticized as being selective. The former High Commissioner once said, I think in 2013, the real litmus test for the indivisibility also would be the ratification of the optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The individual complaints procedure, that's a classical Western, we always wanted individual complaints, the others wanted state reports. No? The EU always obstructed already the drafting of the protocol, and now we have 8 states altogether, finally, out of the 28 that ratified the optional protocol. So that's not a very, so they are so far failing this litmus test, I would say. Yeah, finally, I would say, if we look at the composition, also the main criticism being too selective, being too politicized, I would say at the beginning the Council did worse than the former Commission. If we now take the 10 years, I would say it's about the same. It is not less politicized, but it's also not more politicized. It's simply when states are discussing human rights issues, this is politicized. But I don't think that's a progress, but also it's not a failure. The composition the same. Some of the worst human rights violators could be prevented from joining the Council, but that was the same in the old Commission. That was the same discussion that we had. The special sessions, that's certainly progress. I think that's a new element that gives also the EU or EU together with Gulag or other countries a possibility to say we react very quickly to a human rights emergency and adopt a resolution, sometimes immediately a commission of inquiry. That does have an impact, as we have seen, for instance, in Libya or in Cote d'Ivoire. And if we take all the special sessions now together, there were 21 now special sessions in those 10 years, 7 of them dealt with Israel, so it's 1/3, not anymore 1/2, 4 with Syria. And then if you look at the other states, Sudan, Myanmar, Congo, Sri Lanka, Haiti, Cote d'Ivoire, Central African Republic, Burundi, Iraq, Boko Haram, it is a fairly representative blacklist, as we called it before, of states where there are serious human rights violations. UPR already, and I should also say these high-level commissions of inquiry are a very important new element in addition to special rapporteurs, because of being very high level. So we had already in Darfur the first one, and in relation to Israel, but also to Syria, to Libya, North Korea, the most recent report, which is a very, very strong report, speaking about crimes against humanity, and actually demanding that North Korea should be submitted to the International Criminal Court and stronger action by the Security Council. UPR, I said, I think finally UPR is a success. Also because it's, for instance, I did, after I finished my mandate, an EU-sponsored project in assisting governments in implementing or preventing torture. Governments that were willing, in principle, doing that. And I was amazed. Togo was one country, Paraguay another, Moldova. I was amazed how well even the highest, the Prime Minister, other ministers, high-level governmental officials, know exactly what were the recommendations that the government has accepted. I was amazed about that. And of course the EU delegation there or other donors can use that very well. You are no longer coming to a country and saying, as the EU, you should do that because we Europeans think that's good for you. You simply come and say, we offer assistance. Assistance to your government in order that you better implement the recommendations that you voluntarily accepted in Geneva. It's a totally different approach and a more effective one. The EU has really, and also others, are taking that up and saying we assist governments in implementing these recommendations. And at the beginning, we said that they wanted to abolish special procedures. In the moment we have more than we have ever had before. We have 41 thematic mandate holders and 14 country-specific mandate holders, so that's altogether 55. We have never had that in the, and they are going in all civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights, but as I said, also issues like the economic and financial crisis, poverty, foreign debt, climate change, right to environment, human rights in business, a more equitable international order, illicit financial flows and tax evasion, the impact of hedge funds and the enjoyment of human rights, the effect of unilateral coercive measures. And I think that's also where the EU has to accept that these are not issues that only should be dealt with in the World Trade Organization or any other of those bodies. They are genuine human rights issues, and I think if the West finally can be convinced that these topics are at the core of the future human rights policies and take decisive steps to revise the current global economic order towards more equality and global justice, then I think that the Human Rights Council might turn out to become a big success story as the facilitator for this change of economic policies. The adoption of the Agenda 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals in September last year by the General Assembly, I think was a very important first step. And if the Human Rights Council would be willing to really adopt a human rights-based approach in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, then I think we can say it was worthwhile to replace the Commission by the Council. Sorry for being long, but thank you very much for your attention.